to begin with something that will change the way you understand every difficult relationship you have ever had. Not the surface version. Not the version that tells you to set boundaries and cut people off and protect your energy and surround yourself only with those who lift you higher. Not that version, because that version, however well-intentioned, however temporarily relieving, is still looking at the wrong thing. It is still focused on them, on the toxic person, on their behavior, their patterns, their darkness, their damage. And Gabor Maté spent 50 years showing us that the most important thing to look at is never them. It is always you. Not in the way that blames you, not in the way that says you deserved what happened or that you attracted it through some failure of character or some deficiency of worth, but in the way that is far more radical and far more healing than blame or innocence, either one. In the way that says the answer to why this keeps happening, why the same kind of person finds you again and again across different cities and different decades and different versions of your life. The answer to that question is not in them. It is in the light. Your light, the specific, particular, unmistakable quality of interior luminosity that you carry, that you have always carried, even in the moments when you were most convinced you had none, and that certain people can detect with a precision that should astonish you. Not because they are gifted, not because they are special, but because they have spent their entire lives developing an extraordinary sensitivity to exactly the kind of light that you emit. And today I'm going to tell you the truth about that. The full truth. Not the comfortable version and not the blaming version. The real one. The one that Gabor Maté arrived at after 50 years of sitting with both the people who carry the light and the people who are drawn to consume it. The one that is difficult and liberating in equal measure. The one that begins not with a judgment about toxic people, but with a question about yourself. What is it in you that they are actually drawn to? Because it is not random. It was never random. And the moment you understand what it actually is, the specific quality of your specific light, and why it is so magnetic to the specific kind of person who has repeatedly found their way into your life, you will never be confused about this again. And confusion, Gabor Maté always said, is one of the most expensive emotional states a human being can live in, because it keeps you circling the surface of the problem while the root goes untouched. The root is what we are going to today. Let me begin where Gabor Maté always began, with the body, with the nervous system, with the specific history that created the specific light you carry and the specific vulnerability that comes attached to it. He would say this. He would say it plainly and without softening it. He would say, the people who are most consistently targeted by what we call toxic behavior are almost always people of unusual sensitivity, unusual empathy, unusual capacity for attunement, for feeling into the experience of others, for sensing what is needed, for making other people feel genuinely seen and understood and received. These are extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily valuable human qualities. They are also, and this is the part that nobody in the self-help space wants to say out loud, they are also almost always the product of a childhood in which those qualities were not a gift that developed freely. They were an adaptation, a survival strategy, a skill that was honed to a very fine point by a young nervous system that needed to be exquisitely sensitive to the emotional states of the people around it in order to navigate an environment that required that sensitivity. In other words, the gift and the wound are the same thing. The extraordinary capacity for empathy that makes you a person of rare light, the quality that makes people feel, in your presence, more seen and more held and more understood than they have ever felt with anyone else. That capacity was developed, in most cases, in an early environment where reading the emotional temperature of the room was not a preference, but a necessity, where tuning into the needs of others before your own was not a choice, but a condition of maintaining connection with the people you could not survive without. Gabor Maté calls this the loss of self in the service of attachment, and he says it is one of the most common and one of the most costly psychological adaptations available. Because what it produces is a person of genuine, luminous, extraordinary warmth and care, and a person who has, in the process of developing that warmth, learned to orient perpetually outward, to give before being asked, to sense before being told, to make others comfortable at the expense of their own comfort, to prioritize the emotional reality of the people around them over the emotional reality inside themselves. And that person, that specific, precious, hard-won configuration of a human being, is the most magnetic thing in the world to someone who has spent their life in emotional darkness. Not because darkness is evil, not because the person drawn to your light is a villain in a story where you are the hero, but because they are someone who has never learned to generate their own warmth, who has never been shown how to sit with their own discomfort, who has never developed the internal resources to regulate their own emotional states without drawing from an external source. And they can feel, with a precision that is almost animal in its accuracy, the presence of someone who has an abundance of exactly what they need. You are that someone. And the truth about why they find you, the truth that Gabor Maté arrived at, that changes everything when you really let it land, is this. They are not drawn to your weakness. They are drawn to your strength, to your light, to the very qualities that make you extraordinary. The capacity for empathy, for holding, for seeing, for giving, for making space, these are not your vulnerabilities. They are your gifts. The vulnerability is not in the gifts themselves. The vulnerability is in the relationship you have with those gifts, in whether you give them from fullness or from fear, from genuine choice or from the old adaptation that taught you that giving was the price of belonging. If this is landing somewhere in your body, if you feel that particular quality of recognition that comes when something that has been confusing for a very long time suddenly makes a different kind of sense, I want you to drop 520 in the comments right now. 5, 2, 0. The frequency of the pattern finally being seen. When you type 520, you are saying, I see what has been happening. I understand it differently now, and I am ready to carry my light in a way that no longer costs me everything I have. Type 520 and stay with me, because now I want to give you the 7 truths. The 7 specific things that Gabor Maté identified about the relationship between your interior light and the people who are drawn to diminish it, not to frighten you, not to make you distrust your own warmth, but to give you the understanding that makes genuine protection possible, because you cannot protect what you do not understand. And you cannot understand this until you are willing to look at both sides of it, both the light and the wound that lives alongside it. The first truth, your empathy is not the problem. Your relationship with your own empathy is, Gabor Maté was very precise about this. He said, empathy is not a flaw. The capacity to feel into another person's experience is one of the most healing forces in human existence. The problem is not the empathy. The problem is what happens to empathy when it has no internal anchor. When the person who feels everything for everyone has never been taught or never given permission to feel with equal depth and equal legitimacy for themselves. When empathy has no anchor in self-awareness and self-compassion, it becomes something else. It becomes a river with no banks. It flows wherever the gradient pulls it, always toward the person in most need, always toward the greatest pain, always toward the void that most urgently requires filling. And the people who carry the deepest voids, the people whose internal emptiness is most profound, whose need is most consuming, will always receive the most of that unanchored flow, not because they deserve it most, because they need it most. And your nervous system, trained from its earliest years to orient toward need, cannot distinguish between deserving and needing. The anchor is self-awareness. It is the capacity to feel your own feelings with the same quality of attention you offer to others. To notice in your own body when the giving has crossed from genuine generosity into the familiar old territory of self-erasure. To be able to say to yourself first, and then if necessary to others, this is not mine to carry, and to mean it, not as a rejection, as a boundary, as the act of someone who finally understands that their light is not infinite and that protecting it is not selfishness. It is survival. The second truth. What looks like toxicity in others is almost always unhealed pain in a familiar form. Gabor Maté never used the word toxic in the way our culture uses it. He was deeply resistant to the language of labeling people as toxic because he understood, from 50 years of sitting with people who had been labeled exactly that behind every behavior that looks toxic from the outside is a history that makes complete sense from the inside. A nervous system that was shaped by experiences of profound neglect or violation or emotional unavailability. A child who was not given the tools to regulate their own internal states. A person who learned, in the only way available to them in the environment they were given, to get their needs met through manipulation or control or emotional consumption of others. This does not excuse the behavior. Gabor Maté was equally clear about that. Understanding the root of someone's behavior is not the same as accepting the behavior. The wound that created the pattern does not give the pattern permission to continue indefinitely at the expense of the people in its path. But understanding the root does something that judgment and labeling cannot do. It removes the mystery. It takes away the particular confusion that comes from trying to understand behavior that seems irrational from the outside, but is, from the inside, operating with complete internal logic. When you understand that what you have been experiencing as toxicity is actually someone else's unhealed pain expressing itself through the only behavioral language it learned, and when you understand that your light is what that pain is drawn to, because your light offers what the pain has always been looking for, the experience of being genuinely met, then you can respond differently. Not from fear, not from rage, not from the exhausted place of someone who has been giving and receiving nothing in return, but from understanding, from clarity, from the grounded, compassionate, non-self-erasing position of someone who sees what is happening and chooses, with full awareness, how much of their light to offer and under what conditions. The third truth: you were trained to find the broken bird. Gabor Maté said this in a way that stopped the room. He said, the children who learn to take care of the emotional needs of their caregivers, who learn to read distress and respond to it and make it better before attending to their own, those children become adults who walk into a room full of people and find, with unerring accuracy, the one person who most needs to be taken care of. Not because they are looking for them, because their nervous system was built to detect that frequency. It was trained on it. It knows it the way a musician knows a particular note, by feel instantly without thinking. And so you do not find yourself in relationships with damaged people because you are naive, or because you have poor judgment, or because you cannot see the warning signs. You find yourself there because your nervous system is exquisitely calibrated to detect need. And need, genuine, deep, authentic need, feels, to a nervous system trained on it, like home, like familiarity, like the particular emotional frequency that has always meant connection. The work is not to become less sensitive. The work is to expand what you are sensitive to train the nervous system, gradually, patiently, through accumulated experiences of choosing differently, to detect not just need, but also nourishment. Not just the person who requires the most from you, but the person who is also capable of giving, of receiving your light without consuming it, of meeting you in the mutual exchange that genuine connection requires. That is a different frequency than the one your nervous system learned on, and learning to recognize it, to feel it as home, rather than as suspiciously easy, is some of the most important work available. The fourth truth: your light does not need to be dimmed. It needs to be directed. This is perhaps the most important thing Gabor Maté understood about this dynamic, and it runs directly counter to a great deal of what the self-protection conversation in our culture teaches, because the culture tells you, if toxic people are drawn to your light, turn down the light, become less open, less warm, less available, less empathetic, build walls, guard yourself, stop giving so freely. And Gabor Maté said that is not healing. That is a different wound. That is the wound of someone who was burned and responded by deciding never to feel warmth again. And it costs just as much as the original pattern, in a different direction. The answer is not less light. The answer is discernment. The capacity to feel and to give and to be genuinely open, while also being anchored enough in your own experience, your own needs, your own felt sense of what is happening in your body, to know the difference between a connection that nourishes and a connection that consumes. Between giving that comes from fullness and giving that comes from the old fear that if you stop giving, you will lose the connection. Between someone who is drawn to your light because it warms them and someone who is drawn to your light because they intend to own it. That discernment is not cynicism, it is wisdom, and it is available not through defensiveness or closure, but through the very quality of self-awareness and self-compassion that makes your light possible in the first place. When you are as attuned to yourself as you are to others, when you give the same quality of attention to your own internal experience as you give to everyone else's, you will know. Your body will tell you. The tightening in the chest that says this is taking more than it is giving. The exhaustion that follows certain interactions that has nothing to do with how much time was spent. The gradual dimming of your own inner sense of aliveness that happens when a connection is consuming rather than nourishing. Listen to those signals. They are the most reliable information available. They are your nervous system, the same extraordinary instrument that has always been able to detect the needs of others, finally being invited to detect your own. The fifth truth: the most magnetic thing about you is also the thing most in need of protection. Gabor Maté spoke about this with a tenderness that I have found nowhere else, because he understood, from his own history, from his own early wound, from his own lifetime of giving to his patients with a completeness that sometimes left nothing for the people closest to him. He understood from the inside what it costs to carry this kind of light. He understood that the quality that makes certain people extraordinary, the capacity for genuine presence, for deep listening, for making another person feel, perhaps for the first time in their life, that they are truly seen. That quality requires the person who carries it to be, in a sense, perpetually exposed. You cannot offer genuine presence from behind a wall. You cannot offer deep listening from a defended position. The openness that makes your gift possible is the same openness that makes you accessible to those who would take more than they give. And so the protection that is needed is not the protection of closure, not the wall, not the withdrawal. It is the protection of rootedness, of being so genuinely present to yourself, so anchored in your own experience, your own needs, your own felt sense of who you are and what you value, that the openness you offer to others is offered from a place of genuine fullness, rather than from the anxious, depleting, self-erasing place of someone who gives because they do not know how to receive. That rootedness is built slowly, through practice, through the repeated choice to turn the quality of attention you offer to others inward toward yourself, through learning, perhaps for the first time, that your own experience is as real and as worth attending to as anyone else's, that your light matters not only as something to give, but as something to inhabit. The sixth truth: you are not responsible for carrying people toward their own light. This one is perhaps the hardest for people of genuine empathy to hear, because there is something in the person who carries this kind of light that believes deeply, quietly, at a level that often does not have words, that if they just give enough, if they just hold space consistently enough, if they just remain present through the difficult behavior long enough, eventually the person they are giving to will find their own light, will heal, will arrive at the version of themselves that the light bearer has always been able to see in them, the version beneath the wound, beneath the damage, beneath the behavior that has been causing harm. And Gabor Maté says this belief is itself part of the wound, not because people cannot heal. They can. He spent 50 years watching them do it, but because healing requires the genuine will of the person doing the healing. It requires their own choice to turn toward their own pain, their own history, their own constructed world, and begin the work of seeing it clearly. And that work cannot be done for them. It cannot be done by the person who loves them most consistently, or gives to them most generously, or holds the vision of their potential most faithfully. Your light can illuminate the door, but you cannot carry someone through it. And the attempt to do so, the sustained, loving, exhausting, self-depleting attempt to be the source of healing for someone who has not yet chosen to heal, is not compassion. It is the old pattern, the trained orientation toward need, the learned belief that your value lies in what you can do for others rather than in who you simply are. Your light is not a service. It is not a resource to be directed toward the most needy recipient and depleted in the service of their healing. It is you. It is the expression of who you are when you are most fully yourself. And it belongs, first, always, most fundamentally, to your own life, your own becoming, your own ongoing, imperfect, profoundly important journey toward the fullness of who you were always meant to be. The seventh truth, and this is the one that Gabor Maté said changed everything when it was genuinely understood. Not understood intellectually, but understood in the body, understood in the felt, lived, irreversible way that real understanding always works. The people who have been drawn to consume your light were never your enemies. They were your mirrors, not mirrors of your weakness, mirrors of your wound, specifically mirrors of the specific way your wound expresses itself, through the overgiving, through the self-erasure, through the compulsive orientation toward need, through the old trained belief that being of value to others is the condition of being loved. Every person who has taken more than they gave from your light was, in a precise and painful way, showing you something about your relationship with your own light, about how much you value it, about how much you believe you deserve to keep it. And when you see that, and when you can look at the pattern, not with shame and not with blame, but with the clear-eyed compassion of someone who finally understands both sides of it, something extraordinary becomes possible. Not just the ability to recognize and limit the people who consume your light, but the ability to become genuinely curious about your own light, to turn toward it, to ask not just how do I protect this from others, but how do I inhabit this for myself? How do I live from this place of genuine luminosity rather than just giving it away to everyone who reaches for it? That curiosity, that inward turning of the same quality of attention you have always given so freely outward, is the beginning of the most important relationship available to you. The relationship with your own interior life, with your own experience, with the light that was always yours before it was anyone else's resource. Gabor Maté said something in a conversation that I carry with me as one of the most important things I have ever heard. He said, the people who have the most to give are almost always the people who were given the least. And he said it not with pity, with reverence. with a deep recognition of someone who understood both the cost and the extraordinary value of what those people carry. You were given the least in some specific and important ways. You know which ways. Your body knows them even if your mind has constructed explanations around them. And from that not enough, you built something extraordinary. A capacity for presence and empathy and genuine care that the world desperately needs, and that is, in the truest sense, irreplaceable. That capacity is not your wound. It is your gift. Built from your wound, yes. Inseparable from your history, yes. But genuinely, luminously, extraordinarily yours. And the work, the real work, the last work, the work that all of this has been pointing toward, is not to protect your light from others. It is to finally, fully, unapologetically give it to yourself. To inhabit it, to sit in it, to stop pouring it outward in the direction of every person who reaches for it and start receiving it yourself. In the mornings before anyone else makes a demand, in the quiet moments when the old pull towards someone else's need arises and you pause, just pause, and ask, what do I need right now? What is my light trying to show me about my own experience, my own life, my own becoming? Because your light was never only for others. It was always, first and most fundamentally, for you. And the privilege of a lifetime, the one that Gabor Maté pointed toward with everything he had, through every book and every lecture, and every hour of sitting with human beings at the full depth of their most honest experience, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not the version of yourself that learned to shine for others so they would stay, but who you truly are, in the full, unguarded, unharvested, for no one but yourself luminosity of your own interior life. That life is yours. It always was. Come home to your own light.